Hey everyone, welcome to The Link Online. My name is Zach. Hey, so excited that you have joined us wherever you are watching from as we continue in this series called Do Something, where we are asking this question: why doesn't somebody do something when we see injustices in the world, when we see suffering, when we see hard things happen around us? Many of us are led to ask this question: why doesn't somebody just do something? Especially those of us who maybe you're watching tonight and maybe you are a Christian, or you're trying to live for Jesus, or maybe you're trying to ask questions about that. And one of the big questions you have is this: what is God doing about everything that we see happening in the world? And so throughout this series, we've been talking about this. And one thing we talked about last week that we want to hit on, that God is anti-justice. That's kind of a theme of this series. And part of following Jesus means that we care about the things He cares about enough to do something. That's kind of how we started a couple of weeks ago with this idea that following Jesus means, like, what does it mean to really be a Christian? What does it mean to really live for Jesus in a world where things happen that we don't understand? Well, it means that number one, we have to stop. And the first step, we got to care about the things He cares about. The whole goal of Christianity is to follow Jesus, to become like Jesus. And the first step in that is caring about what He cares about. And He cares about this topic of injustice. For instance, He says in Isaiah 61:8 right here, "For I, the Lord, love justice." A little bit later, it says, "Mankind, He," meaning God, "has told each of you what is good and what is right, and what is the good and what is the right. The Lord requires of you to act justly, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with your God." And we've talked about throughout this series, this is a snapshot. Like, God cares, God loves justice, God cares about justice, but we still have this question: why doesn't somebody do something about it? Well, last week, and if you're watching for the first time, we've got to hit on what we talked about last week, because it's everything. It's really the foundation of this entire series. It really is God's answer to this question, and our answer to the question, why isn't God doing something? And the answer to that is that God did do something about injustice. Not just the injustice you're seeing in the world, or that maybe you're experiencing, or the suffering that you have seen or experienced. Not just the ones that I have seen, but all suffering, all injustice, that God did something about that. And the answer is Jesus and the cross. There was purpose to the cross, that when Jesus sacrificed Himself on the cross, He did it for a reason. There was an exchange happening on the cross that we have got to think about, because it helps us answer the question of how did God do something about this? Well, we're saying the answer is that God did do something on the cross when He judged Jesus in our place. For example, all the sins that had ever been committed before Jesus, Jesus was judged for on the cross. All the sins that have happened after Jesus' death and His resurrection, all the sins that you and I have committed, God has judged those sins on the cross. So at the cross, something incredible was happening. All sins, past, present, and future, all of them were being judged at one time in one act on Jesus. He was being judged for me. All the sins I committed last night or in the week before that I know about and don't know about, Jesus was judged for those sins, like the judgment for those sins, the consequences that I deserve. Jesus took that for me all the sins that you or your friends, that y'all did, the things y'all did last weekend that we deserve. Like, these are against God's will. We deserve to be judged. Jesus was judged for those things. And so when we look out into the world and we say, why isn't God doing something about all the evil in the world? The answer is that He did when He judged Jesus on the cross. He judged Him not just for my sins, for your sins, for all sins, for all evil actions, for all injustices that have ever been committed. Jesus was judged for them on the cross. And what that means is that for a certain time, for a period of time, and we don't know when Jesus will come back or when we'll meet Jesus when we die. We don't know how long that is. Jesus has bought this period of time for us, for people to respond in faith to Him and to believe in Him and to follow Him. And that now this message, this truth, what we just talked about, we are God's answer to the world. And that's beautiful, and that gives us hope, and that's incredible. And I hope that gives your life purpose, because it can. You can have a new purpose tonight. God has a purpose for you to know Jesus, and you can know Jesus because He died for you, for your sins. He was judged for you in your place on the cross so that we wouldn't have to experience the consequences of our sins. And we can take that message. That is the message of hope we can take to the world. But that doesn't mean that you and I won't continue to experience hard times. So that's all good and that's all great. But tonight you might be wondering, how do I handle injustice when injustice is happening to me? It's not just happening around me, Zach. It's happening to me. I am experiencing it. Well, tonight that's what we want to talk about. How do we experience these things and keep our faith in God? How do we go through these things and continue to be used by God? How does God use these things for a bigger purpose? And so tonight, we're going to look at this incredible story in the book of Daniel, and it's a book in the Old Testament. It's an incredible moment. It's a miraculous moment. So let's just get ready for this moment. It's incredible. It's challenging to our minds, but that's what I love about the Bible, is that we can read about people who've went through this, who've went through hard times, who've experienced injustices, who have suffered and kept their faith through it, and God has used it all. So we're going to specifically be in Daniel chapter 3, but we've got to set it up with a few points here. Number one, we got to catch up on the reality that Israel, the nation, was conquered by Babylon, the nation. Israel had turned from God. Israel had started to worship other gods. The leaders of Israel, like the religious leaders, had started like not following God's commands and just forgetting about God. And God had warned them, if you do this, there will be consequences. And they didn't listen. And so part of their consequences was this other nation, the nation of Babylon, coming in and conquering them. And not just conquering them, but taking over their big cities, taking over Jerusalem, and taking the people from their homes and taking them to become slaves and servants in Babylon. Can you imagine that? These people were literally taken from their homes. Some of you may be able to relate to that. Some of you may have had to flee from where you used to live. Now you're here wherever you're watching from. You can relate to this. So within this process and within the Israelites becoming servants in Babylon, a few of them that the book is really about, that the story is really about, is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are some amazing future child names that you can write down. These four men are put in leadership in the palace court in Babylon because it just seems like they have wisdom, they have great leadership skills, and just there's some favor about them. We see in the big story of the book that it's God's favor. Even in their suffering, God's using them. And specifically, we're going to focus on these three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They become so popular and have so much influence with the Babylonian king that the palace court, the other Babylonians, get jealous, and they convince the king to create a new law, build a new statue, and create a new law that basically says anyone who worships anything else other than this statue, other than you, the king of Babylon, should be sentenced to death. Because they knew that these men, even though they were suffering, they were remaining faithful to their God. They were remaining faithful to the God of Israel. They were continuing to pray, and God was blessing them with favor and giving them influence. And out of their jealousy, they convinced the king to create this bogus law targeting them. The whole point of this law was to target them. And so They catch them continuing to pray, not bowing down to the king's statue, keeping their faith in God. And so they're arrested unjustly for their faith, and they're sentenced to be burned alive. And that's where we pick our story up tonight. In this moment where they are taken to this huge furnace and they're thrown in for their faith. And it's so beautiful. In this moment, the king gives them one last chance to turn from serving Jesus, or to turn from serving the God of Israel and to serve the king of Babylon. And they say, you know what? No, our God will save us. And even if he doesn't save us, we're still not going to worship you. We're still not going to worship a false god. And so the king orders them to be thrown into the fire. And that's where we pick up in our story, because something miraculous happens when they are thrown into the fire. It says, then King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon we're talking about, leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, your majesty. And he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. Someone who didn't believe in God is all of a sudden now like praising God, like exalting his name in this moment. The king says, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they came out of the fire, and the satraps and prefects, the governors, the palace court, right, and the royal advisors crowded around them, and they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. In other words, this miracle happens. This 4th person shows up and protects them in the fire. God shows up. God intervenes in a miraculous, mind-boggling way, in a supernatural way, in such a way that from this moment on, this king continues to exalt them within his advisors and continues to give them leadership responsibilities. He even creates a new law that protects Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their faith. So they go from being arrested to a new law being given for them, to protect them, to bless them. They go from being, judged by these palace court officials to being blessed by the king. What a turn of events. What a miraculous situation. What a moment where God intervenes and shows us in this story that, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when you suffer for your faith, when you suffer unjustly, he's going to show up. In other words, he wants us to know, he wanted them to know that God's with you. You're remaining faithful in this suffering, and it's unjust, and it's not right, it's not fair, but because you're remaining faithful, I am with you. I want you to know tonight, when you experience injustice, you don't have to face it alone, because God is with you. I hope this gives us hope tonight. And you may hear this story, and there's kind of 2 different groups in the story, and you may relate to one of these groups. The first one is maybe tonight you relate to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You're going through suffering, and maybe it's not right, and maybe you don't understand it. Maybe you're trying to keep your faith, or trying to even learn what it means to have faith in Jesus while you experience things like they experience, but just because of who you are. Because let's get real, they were judged because they were Israelites. In other words, they were judged because of their race. They were pushed to the side because of their race. They were made outcasts because of their faith. They were like, people were after them and creating unjust, bogus laws just to target them. Like they suffered unjustly. Maybe you relate to them. Maybe your story is just a story. Maybe what you're going through, maybe your circumstance right now is just really, really hard. Maybe that's who you relate to. So we want to take a couple steps forward into the New Testament after Jesus comes. Remember, Jesus is the answer. Jesus is with us. Jesus knows what that's like. Remember, Jesus was judged because of his race by the Romans. He was put on the cross. Jesus was pushed to the side as an outcast. Jesus was pushed to the side because he came from a no-name family with not a lot of money. Jesus knows what that's like. Jesus knows what it's like to suffer when you don't deserve it because he was sinless and he suffered for sinners. It's incredible. And one of his closest followers, Peter, writes to the early church. And what happened in this moment is the early church in Jerusalem experienced this incredible persecution, kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were exiled from their homes and sent into these local regions, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and all of Israel were exiled and taken from their homes. They were sent from their homes. And Peter's writing to them. And he writes them this encouraging verses to help them make sense of how to keep faith in God and go through hard times and suffering. He writes this in one of his letters in 1 Peter, says, "Finally, all of you should be of one mind, sympathize with each other, love each other as brothers and sisters." In other words, listen to each other. When you're both talking about what you're going through, even if you don't understand it, sympathize, listen to each other. Man, is that not a message that we need to hear right now in our culture? Listen to each other. Be tender-hearted and keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They experienced unjust suffering. They no doubt in moments probably didn't have a humble attitude. They probably wanted to repay evil for evil. They probably wanted to retaliate when they were insulted, but they didn't. They kept their faith in God and they trusted God and they blessed people who were evil towards them and retaliated toward them. Is this not what Jesus did for us? Instead of judging us who have sinned against him, who turned from him, he died for us. Like instead of letting us experience the consequences of our sin fully by being judged by God and not being allowed to be a part of God's family, he dies for us. This is like this upside down way of living, and that's what Peter's talking about. That when you're in these moments, you will be tempted to retaliate. You will be tempted to repay evil for evil. But remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember Jesus. He could have judged because he was sinless, yet he chose to sacrificially give himself on the cross for sinners. It's an upside down way of living. It's a new way to go through suffering. It's a new way to have faith in hard times. He continues a little bit later in his letter. Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they literally had a fiery trial. He said, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you are going through as if something strange were happening to you. Instead, be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in his sufferings. In other words, you are becoming more like Jesus, because didn't Jesus suffer for his faith, for his obedience? That sometimes means we are going to experience suffering unjustly. People's evil actions, people's insults that aren't right and that aren't fair. Jesus experienced those things. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego experienced those things. We need to be prepared. We are going to experience those things sometimes, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it is revealed to all the world. When you go through these things, take heart, because you are becoming partners with Christ in his suffering. In other words, you are being like Jesus, living in an upside down way, not repaying evil for evil, not insulting even though you want to because people have insulted you, but living in an upside down way, living in a gospel way, living in a kingdom way. You're living like Jesus. You're looking like Jesus and the way that he went through his suffering. You're becoming like him. And in that, God is going to bless you in that. So take heart if that's where you're at tonight. Maybe some of us are in a different group tonight. Maybe tonight you relate to the palace court. The people who did things that just weren't fair, weren't right. Maybe throughout this series, you're seeing your actions, you're seeing some of the jokes that you laughed at were super offensive. Maybe some of the things you've posted were super hurtful and were the opposite of what Peter tells us to do, to sympathize with one another, to love each other as brothers and sisters, to be tenderhearted, to stay humble, to not repay evil for evil, to not retaliate. Maybe somebody posted something, you immediately retaliated. Maybe somebody was insulting somebody you care about or a leader you care about or your view of politics, and you immediately responded and retaliated. The opposite of what Peter encourages us to do. Maybe you've done the opposite of sympathize with someone who's different from you, that comes from a different country than you, whose family maybe has just been brought through things that you don't understand, and maybe you've judged them, maybe you've made fun of them, maybe you've just done things and you're seeing for the first time throughout this series, wow, am I kind of like the palace court? Are some of the things I've said and done hurtful? Am I really listening to people? Am I really treating people? Am I sympathizing? Am I loving people the way that Jesus wants me to? That's a hard question, but maybe some of us in this room are seeing this in ourselves, or maybe not in ourselves, in our family. Number one, Jesus wants this to happen. Anytime we become closer to Jesus, His truth, His light, His presence reveals stuff in us because He wants us to become like Him. And part of becoming like Him is seeing how we're not like Him and seeing some of the actions and the things we say that aren't in alignment with His will or aren't how He would say. In other words, we start to notice that we don't care about things that He cares about. And He wants to change that and transform that in us. He wants to make our heart like His heart. So you have a step tonight too. Maybe for you that's praying this simple prayer in Psalm 139. See if there is any offensive way in me. And the second part of that verse is lead me in your ways. In other words, Jesus, help me see where I'm not like you. Help me see where I'm not caring about the things that you care about. Help me see where I may be like this palace court. Maybe I'm jealous. Maybe I'm repaying evil for evil. Maybe I'm insulting because of my pride. Or maybe I'm just not listening and sympathizing with someone and their story and what their family's gone through, what they've gone through because of the color of their skin. Maybe I'm just kind of arrogantly looking past those things and just making excuses. Or maybe I listen, but then I refute. Maybe then I bring up, yeah, but what about this and this? And instead of just being quiet and listening. Maybe that's you tonight. You can pray this prayer. Jesus, help me see those things. And Lord, help me become more like you. Help me care about the things you care about. And Lord, lead me in how you want me to respond tonight. When you experience injustice, you don't have to face it alone. And then for maybe of those, maybe you've caused some of this. Maybe you're seeing your own sins for the first time. You're not alone either. That's why we exist as a student ministry, because we want to be a place for you to connect. That's why we have small groups, because we want you to know whatever you're going through or whatever things you're seeing in your life for the first time that you want to turn away from and live in a new way. Jesus has a new way for us to go through suffering. Jesus has a new way for us to turn from maybe causing some hurt and some suffering and some pain, to care about what He cares about and live the way He lived. So I want to encourage you right now. What step would Jesus want you to take? And let us know. Message us. Whatever you can do. We want to connect with you. Let us know how we can connect with you and walk with you. Thank you so much for joining in with us. Have an awesome week.